Varigo, an introduction to the language of bricks. Varigo, ninim varigoda. Se usetre, sias orsa. To be or not to be, that is the question. By William Shakespeare. Hakton ja hakmon kambach la versia dong dromogvata lusu, saha ishmivli hissa tsimandevli ofrabju. To meet everything and everyone through stillness instead of mental noise is the greatest gift you can offer the universe. By Eckhart Tolle. You may have noticed that Varigo is not written in the Latin alphabet. It uses its own script called the Varna alphabet. In here, you can see on the left side Varna letters which are used in the Vari language. On the middle part, you can see letters used for foreign sounds, such as names of people and places, and also to explain the pronunciation of foreign vocabulary. And on the right side, you can see numbers and other symbols from Varna which are used in Varigo as well, such as on the left side of this part, the positive numbers, and on the right side, the negative numbers. In the Vari language, there are multiple types of vowels and consonants. The normal 8 vowels, R, A, I, O, U, Ö, Ü, Ö, also have a palatized or yotized version, which means that just the y sound is placed in front of it, such as ya, ye, and yi. The neutral consonants are those which can be combined with both soft and hard consonants, which is important when we are talking about suffixes in grammar. The soft consonants are also called voiced consonants in other languages, include such as b, bzi, and bji. You can also notice that there are diphthongs in here, and this is frequent because Varigo has multiple diphthongs, but these specifically have a Varna version as well. The hard consonants are also called unvoiced consonants in other languages and include those such as hi, fi, and hi. The last type of consonants are the uncombinables, because after these kind of consonants, only a vowel can follow or the word has to stop, not another consonant. And these are I, and ri. Now, let's get over some of Varigo's characteristic traits. First of all, it is an agglutinative language, which means that the words get progressively longer to include more meaning. Analytic languages, such as English, use multiple words for one meaning, whereas languages like Turkish, Finnish, Japanese, and also Varigo can make a word really long to include more. One word would be ikyvyotoksoyo. Ikyvyotoksoyo. This word translates to because we really don't want to go in English. It is composed of 5 parts. First, the stem, iku, meaning to go. Then view, which is changed to vyo to express the first person plural. View means wanting, so this part means we want to go. Then we have o, which is the negation, we don't want to go. Then we have xo, which means because, it is the causative, which means that it is a cause for something other to happen. And the suffix yo just means a confirmation that we really want this, so this can be translated such as really or very. Another feature of Varigo is vowel copy, which you already saw in the previous example. Vowel copy means that the suffix uses the same vowel as the previous syllable. O lucru zysle volaidiki. O lucru zysle volaidiki. Are mosquitoes flying in Oulu? In here you can see the city Oulu ends with a vowel u. So the locative suffix kri has to adapt to that and become kru. Zys just means mosquito, and to form the plural, we have to add the plural suffix li. But because the vowel is it has to become zysle. And in the verb, you see vol being the stem and I meaning they. The last vowel in here is I, volai. So the other 2 suffixes, first of all, the progressive state, or it's also called the terminative because it means that the action will eventually end, has to adapt to that and become di. And the question particle at the end becomes ki instead of k, ku, or with another vowel. However, it's not just vowels that have to adapt to other syllables. It's also consonants in a feature called consonant harmony. This means that consonants have to switch between the soft and the hard version depending on what kind of letter comes before them. I will give you a few examples. First of all, we have da, which is a suffix indicating a direction, such as the dative case, to something. The first word is coenda. You can see that it ends in the neutral consonant ni. So, because it's neutral, the suffix da does not need to change. It stays coenda. The next word is toshida, to the city. And toshi ends in I, a vowel. So, the suffix once again does not need to change. Toshida. But in the last word, it is gruhta, to the mountain. Gruh means mountain and ends in the consonant hi. This is a hard consonant, which means that the suffix da has to change to its hard version, ta. And the word does not mean it can stay gruhda, it has to become gruhta. Our next suffix is xi, which is the causative, and you already saw that in a previous example. It means something like because, due to, since, thanks to. So it is a cause which then leads to something else. The first one is timokso. And here you can see vowel copy because the o has to be changed in the suffix and it doesn't stay xi, it becomes xo. However, the consonant x, xi, does not need to change because the previous syllable ended with a vowel o. The next word is hrumksu. Hrumksu, due to the illusion, ends in mi, and mi is a neutral consonant. So once again, the suffix does not need to change to that, but it needs to change its vowel because the last syllable included u. In the last case, the consonant is a soft version, fyzgzu. Fyz means gas, so this means thanks to the gas because of the gas. But because fyz does not really go with x, it has to change to its soft version, which is gz, gzi. And once again, the vowel has to be copied, so the suffix becomes gzu. And here you can see that gzu and xi do not really have a lot in common. But if you understand the pattern, then you can understand why it becomes fyzgzu instead of something like fyzxi. Grammatical gender, or genus for short, is a feature that many Indo-European languages and Semitic languages display. There are also other languages from other language families, but they most often use some kind of noun classifier system and not the sense of associating gender with grammatical gender, which is what many Indo-European languages do. Varigo does not have this feature. So the sentence "Ni grajli nju pizza tabai," "Ni grajli nju pizza tabai" can mean many things. It can mean 2 people are eating a new pizza. 2 men are eating a new pizza. 2 women are eating a new pizza. A woman and a man are eating a new pizza. 2 non-binary people are eating a new pizza. A non-binary person and a man are eating a new pizza. A woman and a non-binary person are eating a new pizza. And it doesn't even have to use the progressive form. It can also just mean eat a new pizza. So, as you can see, there are many ways this sentence can be interpreted. However, in other languages, this is not so simple. For comparison, I have used 3 languages with grammatical gender and various degrees of that. The first one is Swedish, which does have grammatical gender, 2 to be exact, but that doesn't really display that quite often. It uses it in the article and in the adjective. So the sentence "Ni grajli nju pizza tabai" would be 2 personer äter en ny pizza. You can here see that en, 1, and ny display a grammatical gender. Another example would be French, which takes this concept a little bit higher and also uses the genders masculine and feminine instead of the common gender and the neuter gender that Swedish does. So in here, we already have a mixing up with real gender and grammatical gender. In French, this sentence would be Deux personnes mangent une nouvelle pizza. The article une means that it is a feminine form, and nouvelle, the adjective for new, also reflects that in the ending, because the word pizza, the noun for pizza, is feminine in French. A third example, and obviously the most extreme case of grammatical gender, would be modern Hebrew, a language belonging to the Semitic family. Semitic languages also have verbs in grammatical gender forms, in this case only masculine and feminine. The sentence Nigrali nu pizza tabai in Hebrew means Shnei anashim ochlim pizza hadasha. While gender-neutral languages do not have grammatical gender, they usually do have gendered words referring to specific genders in certain circumstances. Vargo, however, does not, because it completely lacks genus. For instance, the word eha in Vargo means partner, but it also means boyfriend and girlfriend in English, because these words do not have an equivalent in Vargo itself and would always be treated as partner, regardless of their gender. The next word is marja, which is a parent, but it can also mean mother or father. Barnbui means a train conductor, but it also means a train conductress, a female train conductor. And in other languages, such as French, this is more evident because they have distinctly different features and have to be adapted to the gender of the person. The word Nissan means sibling, but it also means brother and sister. And uelans, which, by the way, is not a standard Varu word, but a upper class word called the Shalago register. We will go over that soon. This word means CEO, boss, or master, but it also means chairman or chairwoman. And these words would not be translated like chairman, chairwoman in Varigo, because the concept of man and woman and gendered words in general does not exist. Varigo is not a language that just developed in under a year. It has a long history for over a decade and also used multiple writing systems throughout this time. The first stage of the language could be called something like Early Varigo and lasted from approximately 2011 to 2015. In this stage of the language, I was trying to combine French with Japanese by making Japanese more European and including some of the fun things I learned in my French classes. I'm not a native speaker of either languages, but I tried to incorporate them into my own language. And also at the time, I didn't even consider Varigo to be its own language, but more like a new version of Japanese, using a little bit of French. Some words which entered Varigo from the French side are demain, meaning tomorrow, acheter, which means to buy, soleil, which is the sun, and de, which means of or from. In early Varigo, they would be mang, ashe, solje, and de. In modern Varigo, however, they are mang, asheri, solje, and di. You can see that the de, which was once a particle, changed into a suffix, di. And you can also see that the diacritical markers, e and e, just were lost in time. And this has to do with some of the sound changes Varigo went throughout the past years. You also can see that there are different writing systems. First, Varigo had basically 3 writing systems, similar to Japanese. It had the Varna alphabet, which is still used today but looks completely different. Then it had some kind of kanji, which, just like in Japanese, represent meanings of one word. And in Varigo, this only included nouns. And then there were the particles, which are nowadays called suffixes because they function differently now. And they also have their own symbol. From Japanese, I took some other words, such as hanasu, which means to talk, midori, which means green, san, which means the number 3, and ryori, which means cooking. They in early Varigo were represented as hanasu, midori, san, and yorish. In modern Varigo, they would be hasna, midri, san, yorish. You can see they didn't change that much, whereas other words, which I haven't listed in here, changed dramatically. You can also see that the number 3 had a symbol of its own. Old Varigo versions still had the old Varna alphabet, and they also used different numbers than nowadays. You can also see that the diacritic, the trema, is used in the word Yorish. And this is a feature that I adopted from French, but ultimately dropped because it didn't really matter. The pronunciation of early Varigo wasn't quite consistent and phonemic. So what you write in the letters is not exactly what you pronounce, and it can differ a little bit. Not as much as it does in English, but it's not as consistent as it is in modern Varigo. The next stage of Varigo is called Middle Varigo and lasted approximately 1 to 2 years from 2015 to 2016. In this stage, I made a little bit more experimentation and was more confident with conlanging as a hobby, and I also understood its principles more than previously. In the first stage, I was just trying to make Japanese look different and experiment a little bit, but now I fully understood the concept of what a conlang is and how to develop them. So I created a new language called Varila, and this is where I merged the earlier stage of Varigo with the so-called Boxvarana script. I also included loanwords from the Varila language, which is related to Varigo, hence the names are similar. But the main difference is that Varila, which is its own language, does not have hard consonants. So every consonant and every vowel can be pronounced with a different tone, basically. So it was supposed to be a singing language, a language where I wouldn't stop to have some kind of k, t, p, or some other consonants, but can constantly sing a tone, such as je, jora, hermana, which mean to write, night, and gravity. These words are adopted in modern Varigo, and nowadays there would be je, jora, and hermana, similar to the Varila version. I also made some other changes. For instance, I adopted some loanwords from Turkish because at the time I was spending my holidays and some exchange programs in Turkey. I adopted from my Turkish knowledge the words var, çok, and yok, which mean to exist, to not exist, and very or very much. And they in Varigo became var, yok, çok. I also made the grammar a little bit more agglutinative because previously the grammar was more inspired by Japanese using particles and didn't really have too much of a heavy focus on agglutination. For instance, the negation previously was split in 2 words, ne più in early Varigo, and now it became più lai in middle Varigo. You can also see that the letter L is spelled with an H in the transliteration. This is because the L sound was divided at the time in a high L and a low L, which you also have in English. The high L is L, such as in let, and the low L is such as in well, where it goes back into the throat. So this word would be pronounced pure lie. And also the feature of vowel copy emerged at this stage of the language. For instance, the Turkish word sor means a question. I adopted that into Varigo, which became sor, and the plural form was made with the L, the soft L, and the vowel copy feature o, so it became sorlo, questions. Now we are entering an interesting period in the development of the language called Renaissance Varigo, lasting from approximately 2016 to 2017. I called it Renaissance Varigo because this is a focus where I wanted to turn the language into the direction of older languages such as Latin and Greek. These are languages that I learned at the time, so I wanted to incorporate some of their vocabulary and features into the language. For instance, I adopted some loanwords such as fidelis, which means faithful in Latin, societas, which means society, and osto, which means bone in Greek. And this specifically is modern Greek. There are multiple types of ancient Greek, and I thought that modern Greek was more useful. So these three words became Fidli, Shokye, and Osh in Varigo. I also added some new suffixes. For instance, the Latin abstract suffix thus was integrated into Varigo as these, and it used vowel copy in order to explain an abstract version of the word and some kind of scientific study. For instance, the word amya, which means music, becomes amyatas, which means the study of music, musicology. Then there is the word dosh, which I added with superlative from the Greek suffix tatos, and dosh becomes doshots, which means the strongest, because dosh is strong, doshots, the strongest. Some other changes happened with the writing system as well. As you know, I'm still using the Varana script, but I also experimented with uppercase letters, which previously didn't play a role at all. And I used these for names and at the beginning of sentences, similar to English. I also started to experiment with pronoun drop because usually the language has to include a pronoun as verbs aren't conjugated in Varigo yet. So at the time, I first did that with dropping the I. So whenever a sentence was using a verb and an object or something, then you know that it has to be the I form, the first person singular. The penultimate stage at this point of speaking would be pre-modern Varigo, which lasted approximately from 2017 to 2019. I made two major changes in the language, and the first one is simplification, and the other one is complexification. So, on one hand, it became easier, but on the other hand, it became also more difficult, let's say that. The simplification process included things such as only using lowercase letters, because I didn't really find it useful to use uppercase letters. I also made some spelling reforms in order to make the language more consistent and phonemic. For instance, the writing of U could be with the letters O and U, or with the U and a caron above the word as a diacritic. And also the letter U was pronounced as U. And this was changed to just use it for U in order to make it more consistent with the previous change. And I also had a tendency to not pronounce the final U at the word of syllables. And this is something that comes from Japanese. For instance, in the word des, which means to be in Japanese, you would not pronounce the U at the end. You can say desu, but it sounds odd. And this feature was useful at the beginning to clearly mark that Varigo came from Japanese in some kind of way. But now, as it has its own identity, I didn't find a purpose for it anymore, and I find it more confusing than helpful. I also made some major vowel reform, which means that the diacritics disappeared and the distinction between short and long vowels was lost and instead spelled with two vowels of the same time. I also removed some of the vowels which I didn't really use that much in order to make it a little bit more easier. For instance, the previous sounds e, and a all merged into e. And I also removed the nasals because I no longer needed them and instead replaced them with a vowel plus ng sound. I also removed the comma and the semicolon because I didn't really find a purpose for them. And I removed the stress. Previously, it was stated that a word had a stress, but it wasn't quite clear which syllable was stressed, so you had to memorize them. And nowadays, it's at the point where the language does not have a stress, but you can theoretically stress the first syllable slightly, just like in Finnish, in order to have a consistent speech pattern. And I also removed a minor thing called the relationship markers, because just like in Japanese, earlier forms of Varigo had a marker after names or after words describing other people, such as sibling, in order to describe what kind of relationship you have to them and what kind of hierarchy. But because Varigo is not really focused too much on hierarchy, I removed this feature. And so markers such as lei just basically vanished, and now it's just the name, similar to other European languages. On the other hand, the language also got more complicated. For instance, I introduced verb conjugation, which is something that English speakers are not too familiar with, but speakers of languages such as French and German might be. So I have the pronoun now optional because the final vowel of the verb already indicates what kind of person I'm speaking to. For instance, the word iku, meaning to go, can now be iki, I go, iku, you go, ika, he, she, it goes, iko, we go, iku, you go in the plural form, and ikai, they go. So the pronouns no longer become compulsive. I also dropped the topical particle, which was something that the previous versions had because it was inspired by Japanese, and Japanese has basically topic markers, meaning what word stands in the focus and what word is being talked about. And this is something that's really fun in context languages, but Varigo wanted to be a little bit more logical and transparent, so I've removed this feature. However, in Varigo, the topic markers also included a tense. So that, for instance, var means that it is the principal topic and it's in the present tense. But since this feature is now dropped, we can no longer tell what the time the sentence is in. So I instead introduced some suffixes for tenses, such as he, meaning the past, and she, meaning the future. I also had an infinitive suffix, which I used, which would be ze, but this is a feature that will be removed later because once again, it doesn't really serve a purpose and isn't needed. The suffixes also became a little bit more harmonious because previously I used many fixed suffixes which had fixed vowels and fixed consonants, and I instead modified them to have more the feature of vowel copy because this was a feature specific to Varigo which I wanted to highlight. I also had the complicated idea to adopt the words yes and no to the person that it is being spoken about. So these words kind of look like a verb now, but they aren't really. They basically just reflect what the person is talking about. For instance, if I say ye, then this means something like yes, I do, yes, I think so. But if I say something like ja, it means yes, he, she, it thinks so, and so on. So this can be used in a question such as, do you like to do this? Then I can answer with ye or me, which means yes, I do, no, I don't. Or if somebody asks, are we playing baseball? Then I can answer yo, yes, we do, or mo, no, we do not. Finally, we are at a stage of the language which I would like to call modern Varigo because it is the version that we are using right now. This stage began approximately 2019 and had multiple changes in the writing system Varana, but also in the sound and some slight changes in the grammar and vocabulary. First of all, the Varana writing system changed significantly and most letters became a little bit more circular. The vowels in particular look much more like a round shape rather than close to the Latin equivalents. You can see that with the letter R and E, which basically look very similar to the Latin letters A and U with their openings. And now they are round and they look a little bit more consistent with other varieties. So the Varana script is a little bit more, let's say, aesthetically pleasing in my opinion. I also added the uncombinables because I thought that they are a fun feature, which I have learned when I was studying some click languages. And I thought that these kind of sounds are useful in order to make a drastic change of meaning. For instance, the negation marker is such a distinct sound that I can instantly hear, oh, it has to change the word and impact it significantly. So I thought that they would be fun. And I also just had fun saying these sounds, so I liked to integrate them into my language. I also replaced the letter yi with the yotated vowels, so we no longer have two letters to represent one yotated sound, and instead use one sign to just show that the vowel is palatalized. I also made a little bit of a renaissance by orienting myself not in Greek and Latin, but in earlier stages of Varego, especially the first one, to derive new vocabulary and to make the language a little bit more authentic and its own. For instance, many years I used the word spor to refer to sports, but now I'm using the word forzo which is combined of forzo, to move, and ugo, which means control. Forzo ugo, meaning controlled movement essentially, is sports now. I also use the word tobo in previous versions to refer to something that is black. The word still exists, and nowadays it means dark, but instead for the color I'm using the word kuro, which is obviously inspired by the Japanese kuro. I also added some new affixes, specifically suffixes, but also a few prefixes, in order to create new words. In my opinion, it is very important that a language is able to expand its vocabulary and hopefully use its own grammatical features in order to make some new fun words. In Varego, I made this with these two examples. For instance, ita, which means to become something or to ify something. That is a suffix that exists in English. For instance, ton, an object, becomes tonita, to objectify. And the suffix ihi is something that is the result of an activity. And in English, it can be translated with the suffix ment. For instance, improvement. So something has improved and it's now a noun. In Varego, I'm using the example of pas, which means to spend time, and this becomes pasahi, an event. So to have spent time, something has spent time, and that is an event that has happened. Obviously, this isn't the end for Varego, and there are still some projects which I would like to do in order to expand the language. In previous versions, I used the program ScannerHand to create a font, which were using my handwriting and a scanner in order to digitalize what I had written down. And this resulted in what you can see on the left side. And this is also edited with Paint. So this is the cleaned up version. In the original scanned version, it was a bit more, as handwriting looks. So nowadays I found a new program in which I could create the font entirely digitally, and you can see that on the right side. And this is something that I still want to keep using and maybe create more fonts in order to give a bit more variety and also make them less bulky. I also want to expand my dictionary and to perhaps release some books about the grammar and even learning textbooks for Varego so that people can access the language easier. Because right now, people basically just have the option to rely on my translations or on my dictionaries in order to learn some words, but not actually fluently learn the language as I would like to distribute it in the future. And I'm using that on social media platforms such as Reddit, but also my Varego Padlet. And I will obviously release the online dictionary so that people can have access to it. And I also plan on making some song uploads, songs which I translated into Varego, but also maybe my own creations, because I have written a few songs and I haven't recorded them yet, but perhaps I will do so in the future. Now it's time for you to learn a little bit and give you a few basic phrases which you could hypothetically learn with Duolingo or another language learning app if you were deciding to choose Varego. And the first one is just a basic introduction. So this one would be Yao, nami makumasa, Katja bikonaifai, konnamu, which means hello, my name is Akkuma, nice to meet you, what is your name? I have highlighted my name, Akkuma, in blue, so you can replace it with your name. You can see on the top right how it's spelled in the Latin alphabet. Maybe it's easier to remember if you haven't learned Varana.net, as well as in a IPA transliteration for linguists to know exactly how it's pronounced. But I will repeat it once more in the normal pace and then in a slow pace, and I hope you will repeat it with your name. Yao, nami makumasa. Katja mikonaifai. Konnamu. Slow version. Yao, nami makumasa. Katja mikonaifai. Konnamu. Now let's break down these three sentences grammatically. The first sentence is Yao namimakumasa. This sentence consists of yao, a greeting, which means hello, then namim, which is a noun, nam, to mean name, and it is expanded with the suffix im, which is the possessive marker for the first person singular. In English, that would be a separate word called my, but in Warrego, this is attached to the noun, namim, my name. And finally, we have the name, akuma, and that is expanded with the verb to be, se, in the third person singular, sa. So he, she, it is. So the full sentence is yao namimakumasa. And you also can see that the verb se is attached to the name. And that is only the specific case for to be, se, in Warrego. All other verbs are separate. The second sentence is Katja mikonaifai. And actually, it's not really a full sentence, it's more of an ellipsis, because konaifai, getting to know, get to know, is in the infinitive form. There is actually not a conjugation here. And that is fine, because this is kind of a standard phrase to say. The first verb, katyami, means nice, gentle, or kind, and is an adjective, or in this case, it's also an adverb. Katyami konaifai. And the last part, kon namiu, is a question. What is your name? How named are you, literally? Kon is a question word, which means how, and namiu is a verb that derived from the noun. You already know the noun for name, nam. You can see that in the second word of this entire cluster. But in this case, it functions as a verb because it's in the passive form, name, which means to be named, and u indicates the second person singular. How named are you? And singular, not plural, because unlike English, Warrego distinguishes between singular and plural you. So literally, how are you named? Or what is your name? Ko nameu. Let's talk about languages. This basic phrase is Zinangonim England kosa ame prevargo tudje. My first language is English, and at the moment I'm learning some Warrego. Zinangonim England kosa ame prevargo tudje. This sentence can also be replaced with other languages. In this case, I chose English because the one watching this video is probably an English speaker, but you can also replace it with other languages such as French, Frongsko, Spanish, Españago, Japanese, Nihongo, Finnish, Suomigo, Coptic, Mishko, or other languages as you desire. In this sentence, you can see a bit more what distinguishes Warrego from English. First, the word for first in Warrego actually uses a number symbol, not just the name of the number. So zenan means first, but zen, which means one, is not spelled out, unlike English, but it is written with the letter symbol zen and the suffix an, which indicates that this is first, an ordinal number. Second, we once again have a noun that is possessed, gonim. And actually, go, language, ends in a vowel. And since this is a word that only has one syllable and would look kind of awkward and unrecognized if I replace the final vowel with the im, you have to add the ni letter as a kind of connector. This is not done for words which have more syllables, but for ones which only have one, it is necessary in order to recognize which word we are talking about. Otherwise, it can be very easy to confuse these words. So, gonim, my language. Then we have the language name. In this case, I chose English, Inglendko, and once again, it is expanded with the word to be, sa, it is. So, it is English, Inglendkosa. And then we have something interesting. Unlike English, there are two words for the word and in Warrego. This word is ka, and the other one is ya. The difference between the two is that ya is used when you accumulate words. So when you want to say, I speak English and French, Inglendko ja frongsko langi, then you use ya. for instance. But if you have two main sentences that you want to connect, so to further expand your sentence, not just add in a piece of information, then you use to indicate that the sentence is going probably a lot longer and that there are two verbs. The word mepre indicates something about the time. In this case, it means in this moment, at the moment, or right now. Me, moment, and pre is a suffix which indicates that it is a time. So mepre, in the moment, or while at this particular moment, is what I used in the transliteration. Then I have the other language name, in this case Warrego, just a noun. And finally, the verb, which always comes at the end in Warrego sentences, which is studii. The verb is studia, to learn, and because it is I, the first person singular, I have to change the vowel R to E, studi. Once again, the whole sentence. Zenan gonim England kosa, ame prevargo studie. Zenan gonim England kosa, ame prevargo studie. My first language is English, and at the moment, I'm learning some Warrego. Another feature that I would like to highlight specifically for English is that in the English phrase, I use the present progressive form, I am learning. That is because I used at the moment. But in Warrego, there is no such distinction. So technically, it would be I learn Warrego at the moment, but because in the English translation, the present progressive would be used, it has the same meaning as I am learning. The final basic phrase that I want you to learn today is Ashkim livli romaidi. Instagram repetim prisogrebioko. Ashkim livli romaidi. Instagram repetim prisogrebioko. Which means, my friends are waiting for me. Could we text each other later on Instagram? This sentence has a name of a brand, Instagram, in it. And in Warrego, it is not directly spoken as it would be spelled if I used the Latin alphabet. So in contrast to languages like French, which pronounce them in a different way, I think it's Instagram. In Warrego, it is directly taken from the language where it originated. And since it's English, it also has to be changed significantly in spelling. So it's not Instagram, but it is Instagram, using letters which are not normally used in standard Warrego words. So you might see these letters and think, what are they? So you have to look in the Varana chart on the middle section to recognize these special letters. But let's break down this cluster. Once again, we are starting with a possessed noun, ashkimli. And this case is in the plural, which means that the suffix li is added. And this is a case of vowel copy. So the e copies the im of the suffix that previously followed, my friends, the translation, ashkimli. Then we have for me, ivli, which consists of e, which means I, or in this case me, and vli, which is the suffix meaning for or to somebody. Then there is the verb romaidi. The suffix di indicates that it is happening right now, but it is also happening until a particular point in time. So this is an action that cannot be infinite, but will end eventually. This maybe adds a meaning that it is something that we are doing, but after that we're doing something else. Romaidi, they are waiting right now. And they are not waiting for long. Then in the next sentence, it starts with Instagram. And we also have the suffix ra, which indicates that it is in Instagram. But because Instagram is a social media platform and not a house or a time period, we have to use the suffix ri, which indicates that is something happening in or at something, but that is not touchable, it is abstract. And it is not a time either. So when we are talking about social media, internet, or a concept, then we are using the suffix ri rather than pri, which is for times, or kri, which is used for places. So in Instagram, Instagram. And the word later is also very interesting. So it's not just one particular word, but it's actually a cluster of words. So ptim prisok is the whole word, and it consists of ptim, which is a combination of pti, meaning small, and tim, which is an old word for time, ptim. Then we have the word for time periods, where it's in a particular time, pri, which I used while in the transliteration, and sok, which means in front of, but in this case it means after. So ptimbri sok, after this small time, literally, means later. Ptimbri sok. And finally, we have the question jebioko, which consists of je, to write, bio, which consists of bu, can, and or, meaning that it's the first person plural, and ko, which is the question marker, that this is a yes or no question. So the sentence, can we text each other later? And the whole thing, once again, would be Ashkimli vli romaidi. Instagram sheptim prisogjebioko. Ashkimli ivli romaidi. Instagram sheptim prisogjebioko. Just like any other natural language, Vargo also has different registers, which means that there are levels of speech depending on your social class or the circumstance in which the language is slightly modified to sound a little bit more upper class or a bit more colloquial. And Vargo distinguishes three types of it. In the middle, you can see Igo, which consists of Ig, meaning normal, and Go, language. Igor is the standard language of Vargo. It is perceived as neutral and colloquial, meaning that this is the language you would hear on the news and people talking to each other in a normal way, which wouldn't be particularly associated with a social class or circumstance, but that's just the normal way of talking. One of its features is that it uses abbreviations quite frequently because Vargo words already can get quite long. It uses context clues and also references. So that is not just a particular feature of slang, but also of the standard form of Vargo, Igo. And that's why it's important to, in a hypothetical case, to read Vargo texts, but also pay attention to very short words and more phonetically simple words because they might be an abbreviation. For instance, DIMI, which means email. And DIMI consists of digitli messaggio. Digitli messaggio, DIMI, which is quite shortened. And the normal word would be DIMI rather than digitli messaggio. And another feature is that the duplicated consonants are also shortened, so one of them is removed. And this is important because you might get confused what a word means if it's a bit longer. But actually, if you listen to it, you would hear that the word actually has two consonants, but they just merge together because they happened to end in the same. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that. The first word for computer is Aki. And Aki is an abbreviation of Arashkalkikai or Arashkalkik, which means literally personal calculating device or calculating machine. Aki. And ki is spelled out with an E, but it's actually just the letter ki. So the k. But Aki is the common word to say computer. The second word is actually a sentence because it's a conjugated verb, sengadya. And the verb for to think is sengu. She has to think is the sentence, by the way. Sengu, but in this case it's senga because it's easier to associate the a sound with a normal verb, sengadya, rather than sengudya, which I will get to if you are talking about the other register, shalago. Then the word for CEO or boss usually would be nimsui, which literally means a leader. But the full word is firma nimsui, which means the leader of a company. But you can shorten it to nimsui if you want. If you use the right context, it will be understood as a boss or a CEO. And finally, another sentence just comprised of a verb, which would be kopuku. Do you understand that? Kopuku. This consists of the verb kop, meaning to understand in the sense of logically understanding. So I have heard something and I understand it with my mind. I know what you are meaning. And uku, meaning that it is you. Do you understand that? You can see that in the English translation, there is the word that, which does not appear in this sentence. This is because it makes sense. You don't need that. You can say sia kopuku, do you understand that? But in the normal case, it is not necessary because you understand from the context that it means, do you understand that? Kopuku. Let's talk about the register on the right side, Shalago. This literally translates to gold language. And that is because this is kind of an upper class, polished, but also an archaic version of Vargo. It's also a bit ostentatious. This kind of register uses older Vargo forms and terms to appear a bit more, let's say, educated, but also antiquated at the same time. And unlike the normal and the standard version and the slang, it also leaves duplicated consonants and the original verb vowels because it wants to be a bit more precise and etymologically consistent. So it can be understood what it means based on the origin of the word. And I've used the exact same words that I used for the other two registers in order to give you a comparison. So once again, we are starting with the word computer. And in this case, it's not short. It's arashkalkikai. Arashkalkikai. You can here see that the consonant ki is doubled because kikai, machine, and kalk, to calculate, both end and begin in the ki sound, but it cannot be removed and it actually has to be doubled. In pronunciation, you can double the consonant, which I've listed in the IPA transliteration, kalkikai. However, you don't have to do that. You can also just say arashkalkikai. Then the sentence, she has to think, which in this case would be sengudya. And in this case, we cannot use a for the verb sengu because the verb in its original form is sengu. The reason why it's a in the standard version is because ü is typically associated with adjectives, as many adjectives end in ü, and many verbs, or most verbs, end in a. But in this case, it still has to be sengudya, because in Shalago, it's not important what its grammatical function is, but rather where it etymologically came from. Then we have the word for boss or CEO, which in this case is uelans. You can also see in the IPA that I put the stress on the second syllable. And this is because in the original form, this word actually comes from Old Vargo. There was a stress pattern, not just a loose stress or stress on the first syllable, but actually a consistent stress that had rules depending on each word. So this is an old word, uelans, which means, a leader, a CEO or a boss, and that is no longer used in standard Vargo, but it's still retained in this particular register. And finally, the sentence, do you understand that, is sja kopiku. In this case, you can see that I have to add sja, that, in the translation, because it has to be precise and it cannot be omitted by context. You have to name it sja kopiku rather than kopiku. No language would be complete without a slang version. And in this case, it's gego for Vargo. Gego incorporates lots of loan words, particularly from English and other languages that have an international status, because they are heard frequently. So whatever's on the media, whatever's heard around, influences Gego much more than the other registers. It also uses plenty of abbreviations, just like the standard form, and it simplifies the grammar and uses context or references or insiders to articulate itself. And this can make it harder for learners of the language to understand what it's said, but once you get in it and you can make up your own thing, it's basically just a matter of, does the other person understand me or not, rather than, am I being grammatically correct and is this precise? Once again, I used the same words, but in this case, I didn't want to add computer because that would just be the same word as in standard version. So instead, I'm using a reference, which is gorgeous. Gorgeous means gorgeous in English. And you can see the pun in this word is the spelling. It is comprised of the number go, which means 5, and then ju, which nowadays would be pronounced tai, and that is the number for 10. But in a previous version of Vargo, when this word was created, it was pronounced as ju. And finally, the letter C, s, at the end, gorgeous. Literally, it means 50s, but in this case, because of its pronunciation, it means gorgeous, referring to an appearance. The next word is also influenced by English, and that would be yes. Yes means I like it or I agree. And it is used in a sense of, is this something that you really enjoy, or is this something that you particular find appealing, and you wouldn't answer it to a question, not like yes I like it, but rather just like yes. So just a general statement without it having the connotation of agreeing as it has in English. Then we have 생dia, which means she has to think. And you can see that this is one syllable shorter than the versions in the standard and the upper class version of Varego. And that is because senga already has the R sound, so this can be omitted. And if you just add dia, you already understand from context that it means she has to think, or he or it has to think. Sengdia, rather than sengadia or sengudia. The word for boss or CEO is also a completely different one, and it's actually doja. This is a reference. This comes from the English song Boss Bitch by Doja Cat. And because her name is Doja and she has this line, it is taken into the slang version of Varego and is associated with the word boss, Doja. And finally, do you understand that? Is even shorter than the standard version Kopegu because it is reduced to Kopko. And this is because Kop means understand, and ko is the question marker, which uses vowel copy of the previous syllable. So basically, this word means understood rather than do you understand that? But it can be understood in the context of second person singular, and it makes sense from context. But it does not really make sense grammatically because there is a lack of vowel which indicates which person we are actually talking about. Since I just mentioned a number in the slang part of Varego, why not talk about them and how they are used? Because that also slightly differs from English. Varego uses a decimal system, which is inspired by Japanese, which means that 10 is the base and numbers are added to each other instead of changed to a particular form as it's done in English. For instance, 50, which comes from 5 changed to 50. But in Varego, that's not done. Instead, we're using the base number and we are multiplying it by 10 or another multiplier. So I have used an example of a longer number, which in English would be 2,795. But in Varego, that is 2,795. 2,795. This consists of several numbers and uses multiplication. We first have 2, ni, multiplied by tau, so 2,000. Then we have 7, zun, multiplied by 100, su, so 700, zun su. Then we have 90, which consists of yan and tai, yan tai. And finally, go, the number 5. 2,795, 2,795. This system has some advantages, but also some disadvantages. You can see in this case that it has a disadvantage because it is longer than the word spelled out in Latin. It has more symbols. However, when we are talking about numbers that are whole and don't have too many smaller numbers in it, for instance, 3,000, you can see the advantages because it's just 2 numbers in Varego. 3,000 is santao in Varego. And santao consists of 3, san, and the symbol for 1,000, tao, santao. Rather than writing 4 letters, I just write 2, santao. Another one, which is even better, would be 2,000,004. 2,000,004 in Varego would be nimiarjon. Nimiarjon. And this just uses 3 letters. Nimiarjon. 2,000,004. And another feature which English does not have is the negative numbers. In contrast to the positive numbers, these numbers are 2-syllabic. So you see the positive numbers are quite short. 1, 2, 3, zin, ni, san. And compared to longer numbers in other languages, for instance, in Finnish, the word for 1 would be yksi, which has 2 syllables, yksi. In Varego, it just has 1, zin. But the negative numbers also are a bit longer, and they are also less frequently used. The number 0 is technically not a negative number, but I put it into the chart of the negative numbers just for aesthetic purposes. That would be Sohn. The purpose of these numbers is to indicate something in the negative area. For instance, when we're talking about temperature, when we're talking about money that you have on your bank account, but also when we count money reduction. For instance, if you see 20% off, then this is something that can be spelled out using the negative numbers rather than writing it out 20% in the minus area or something in Vargo. You would just use the negative number. So this is a case where you would use it. Now let's read out some numbers and compare them. I first start with the positive numbers, and you can read with me if you want. Sen, ni, san, yon, go, sem, zön, ze, yan, tai, shu, tau, myo, myar, bio. Now let's compare them to the negative numbers, and I'm starting at 0 on the right side and go to the left side over. Zon, ichi, döze, troa, katri, sanka, kuusi, seise, kahdeksan, növe, kymme, chongta, viisi, sakma, juku, öila. Unlike English, there are no separate words for the months of the year. So January, February, and so on do not have its own word, but they rather just use the number. So January would be Zenmon, the first month. This word would be Nitao Taigo Zen Taiyan. But actually, if we are using the suffixes for year, month, day, and so on, so the longer version, this word would be pronounced Nitao Taigoane Zenmon Taiyanju. So basically, back to front from an English perspective, because it's based on the Japanese system, we're starting with the year, Nitao Taigoane, the year of 2015, Zenmon, the first month, and Taiyanju, the 19th day. English uses this feature by using suffixes and prefixes from Latin, Greek, or sometimes even its own. For instance, if you have the word two-spirit, it uses the number 2, but the number symbol for 2 is actually not spelled in the word, but rather we are using TWO. In Vargo, this is not the case. You would actually write the number instead because you want to show that it is based on the number, and that's also why these words, in my opinion, are easier to remember. However, they might not be easy to pronounce if you haven't encountered the word before. One word is bicycle, which just like in English is based on the number, and the word for wheel, nirota. So we are using the number for 2, ni, at the beginning of the word, nirota. The same applies for car, motorcycle, and other words which use a number. Then we have temperature. And Vargo has its own temperature system rather than using Celsius, Kelvin, or Fahrenheit. And this is called Yakmi. And Ni Yakmi would be equivalent to 19 degrees Celsius. Tayan Kelsi. Ni Yakmi, Tayan Kelsi. And another example of using prices, and this is where I will show you some of the negative numbers, is when we have a price. For instance, if you want to buy something and it costs a lot of money, in this case I'm using its own currency, which is Wien in Vargo. We have something that may cost like 150,000 Wien, which is 25,000 Wien, and it is 30% off. 30. So we say minus 30% essentially. 30 to say off. 30 25,000 Wien. To show you how sophisticated and developed the language is, I want to show you a little bit longer of a text. And by that, I'm citing the same publication that I've already cited previously, which is Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, A Guide to Spiritual Enlightenment. In English, this abstract would be, what is the greatest obstacle to experiencing this reality? Identification with your mind, which causes thought to become compulsive. Not to be able to stop thinking is a dreadful affliction, But we don't realize this because almost everybody is suffering from it, so it is considered normal. This incessant mental noise prevents you from finding that realm of inner stillness that is inseparable from being. It also creates a false mind-made self that casts a shadow of fear and suffering. We will look at all that in more detail later. The philosopher Descartes believed that he had found the most fundamental truth when he made his famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." He had, in fact, given expression to the most basic error, to equate thinking with being and identity with thinking. Kal jabe choreimias lyvlysa. Ksita versiaksha tsisenga apradita. Jok te senga roxpia orier syfratonsa miasja imias titotho hakmonsiaksa syfraksa ikoksha leste haidia sifai versiu dang mitsim ninu kambachvli tsisedi sepravit heimaka. Atvar fjo versiu ilbihraina tsipur ja syfrakausada. Siadra prosprogzakta zorti mikloks. Miktigoi Descartes gzimach unctos moviaimitsach langach pra sengisisti. Mia skiesera unctos mofioton gengach. Senga yaseogzaiksita, yasenga kshanitach. And here is an example of an image translation. I will not read it out, don't worry. You can here see a side-by-side comparison of how an Amazon shopping page would look like in Varigo. On the left side, I chose the Google Pixel 8 Pro, which is written out in English, and you can see things such as the price reduction being a minus symbol, minus 20% in English, and in Varigo we are using the negative number to indicate that it is a reduction. We can also see other things such as translations of the colors and the little texts, and I even added a fictional address to give you a sense of more realistic things. And you can look at that in more detail and hear the full pronunciation on the Varigo tablet. Speaking of the Varigo Padlet, I have uploaded on this QR code some content about Varigo. You can see the dictionary, as well as some fonts and pronunciations and various other images which I translated, as well as texts and potentially some songs. So check it out if you would like to learn more, and perhaps I will release some grammar lessons for you to actually learn the language more in depth than just using the sentences that I provided. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please send them to me. And if you would like a Varigo translation of something or get some phrases to learn, then just reach out to me. Thank you very much.